From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It had been a long time coming.
After 8 months of non-stop negotiation by my administration, a ceasefire and a hostage deal has been reached by Israel and Hamas.
As the announcement of a deal finally came, the Middle East lit up.
هذه الخوذة ميادة التي أرهقتني طوال هذه الفترة وأيضا هذا الدرع الذي كان جزء من جسدي خلال هذه.
On TV screens across the region, people watching Al Jazeera saw one of their correspondents in Gaza who'd chronicled the horrors of the war for months, now clutching his microphone and talking emotionally into the camera as, live on air, he began to unstrap his helmet and tear off his body armour. He said they'd exhausted him for too long. As he announced the news of the ceasefire, the jubilant, cheering crowds around him lifted him onto their shoulders and began to dance. Hope was returning to the war-battered streets of Gaza. 50 miles away, in Jerusalem, there was an overwhelming sense of relief for many.
We've been waiting so long for our hostages to finally come home, praying, hoping, and now it's finally happening, and we're so excited.
But within hours, hope was dissipating. In Gaza, more than 70 people were killed in a fresh round of Israeli airstrikes before the ceasefire was set to kick in. And in Jerusalem, protests broke out and hundreds marched on the Prime Minister's office in anger at what they described as a deal with the devil. There are already disagreements over the terms of the deal. The Israeli government was supposed to give it the final seal of approval yesterday. That's now on hold. Could the ceasefire fall apart before it's even begun?
I urge them to back this deal. Now is not the time for any backtracking. The history of this conflict is littered with missed opportunities. It would be a tragedy to let slip the chance before us.
The story today, a ceasefire in Gaza, but will it hold?
My name is Al-Atrush. I'm the Middle East correspondent for The Times.
Sama, this is a huge moment for the Middle East, potentially. We've heard so much about a potential ceasefire deal being done for months and months and months now. At what point did you think this might just be it?
I think the fact that Donald Trump is coming into office again might have done it. The closer the second term got, the more pressure Hamas and Israel felt, and I think the more pressure the mediators put on them as well. His comeback had a great deal to do with that. He's indicated that he wants the war to be wrapped up by the time he takes office. He's been saying that for months. He's also threatened Hamas that if they don't release the hostages by the time he's in office, he would take action. And I think the perception of Donald Trump in the region and certainly elsewhere is that although he's very, very transactional, he's also not the sort of person that you'd want to ignore. He's very unpredictable. He can take extreme actions that perhaps more cautious U.S. administrations wouldn't take. So that certainly added the pressure on everyone involved, I think.
And in the run-up to the announcement that this deal had been done, we started hearing from the White House, from the Israeli government, that a deal was hours away. Just describe what was happening in the background. What were the movements that made this deal possible?
There's been countless rounds of negotiations over the past year or so, the substance of the agreement hasn't really changed. Initially, Hamas had demanded that Israel guarantee an end to the war. So that guarantee would be in place when the ceasefire begins, and that it withdraw all its forces from Gaza. Israel had demanded that, first of all, they said that the war will end only when Hamas releases all the hostages and Hamas is destroyed. So those were the maximalist positions, really, that they came into the negotiations. And along the way, I mean, according to the mediators, both sides change their positions quite often. In the middle of the negotiations, Israel, for example, decided that we have to keep control of the Philadelphia corridor, which divides Gaza from Egypt. So that was seen as a new condition, and that set back the talks. And then Hamas would come up with their own new conditions, and there would be last-minute changes. That dynamic was there. And what we have finally is something that is very close to what has been discussed all along. Both sides have had to compromise. So Hamas has agreed to allow Israeli troops to remain in Gaza in certain areas, but they will have to withdraw by the end of the first phase, which is 42 days. Israel did not commit to or guarantee ending the war. However, there's a mechanism in place now, which was something that the mediators have been trying to push through really since March or April, that you'd have the first phase, and within the first phase, the first 42 days, negotiations will begin on the second phase, which will lead to, instead of calling it an end to the war, it's being called a sustainable calm, but it really means the same thing. It's a matter of semantics, really. And there would be a monitoring mechanism based in Cairo that would be staffed by officials from Egypt, Qatar, and the US, basically the three countries that mediated the deal, to monitor the implementation of the ceasefire and how it would proceed to the second phase. So really, it's a lot of details, and some details still haven't been worked out. I think it was rather telling that the Qatari Prime Minister said in his press conference yesterday that they will only publish a deal once those finer points had been agreed, and that would be in the coming days. We saw Joe Biden he was rather frustrated yesterday when he did point out that this is pretty much the same deal that he had put forward in May that was accepted by the UN Security Council, and it's only now being agreed.
This is the ceasefire agreement I introduced last spring. Today, Hamas and Israel have agreed to that ceasefire agreement and the whole ending the war. You know, those of you who have followed the negotiations can attest, the road to this deal has not been easy.
One thing that made a difference was Trump sending his envoy, Steve Witkoff. So he went to Jerusalem.
Tell us a bit about him, because he's not your average diplomat.
No, he's not. I mean, like many of Trump's appointments, they're personal friends, partners, old business partners, in-laws, as we saw in his first administration. And in Witkoff's case, I mean, he's not a diplomat. He's a real estate guy, but
a billionaire.
And a billionaire. And he's one of the many billionaires Trump has surrounded himself with. But, he's already had an effect. He came to Israel. He had a very tense meeting with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
The timing was interesting too.
Yeah, so it was over the weekend. And, according to the Israeli press, it was quite tense. And I think he impressed on Netanyahu that this time the ceasefire has to go through, that the deal would have to go through. Then he flew to Qatar, and he was there yesterday when the Qatari Prime Minister announced the deal. He was in the room. And I think it was quite telling as well that the Qatari Prime Minister thanked him first and then thanked Brett McGurk, the acting and current National Security Council Middle East coordinator. He singled out both men for praise, but he mentioned Witkoff first, which I think tells you in order of priority who might have had the most impact in pushing this agreement across the line.
And in terms of what Witkoff did, he flew into Israel breaking the Sabbath on Saturday for an urgent meeting with Netanyahu. As you say, there are reports it was quite tense. Do we know what he said? Do we know what the threats would have been about not doing a deal?
There's been reports about possible exchanges or concessions on perhaps the settlements, and there have been measures that were taken by the Biden administration against the illegal settlement outposts that could be reversed. That's not confirmed. I think he would have impressed on Netanyahu that what Trump's priorities are for the region. You know, he wants an end to the war, and he would very much like to oversee a expansion of the Abraham Accords that were signed between the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. What Trump would like to see is Saudi Arabia joining these accords. That's something that he would very much like to achieve in his second term.
So, Sama, for Witkoff, for Trump's envoy flying into the Middle East, he's got the potential carrot of a Saudi deal for the Israelis. We're hearing, reportedly, he's saying they'd go much easier on them for illegal settlements, possibly even some concessions on some of their spyware. What's the threat? I mean, how serious was he about demanding that this happen in time for the inauguration?
I'm not sure if there was an explicit threat, either do this or else. But I think the threat is always implicit with Trump. If he doesn't like you, if he's upset at you, he can take very drastic action. And Trump's already coming in having had not a very good relationship with Netanyahu. It started off very well. And by the end of his term and afterwards, you know, he had some very tough words for Netanyahu. I think he was upset that Israel pulled out of a operation to kill Qasem Soleimani. I mean, that's what he said publicly, and he felt betrayed by that. And then he also felt betrayed when Netanyahu congratulated Joe Biden on winning the election, which Trump still believes that he won. The joke was always that, you know, Trump could just be sitting in the White House watching a documentary on Gaza or the Israel-Palestine conflict and just completely change his mind about it. And although he's surrounded by what you could say are hawks when it comes to the Israel-Palestine conflict, I mean, people like Mike Huckabee, who approaches it from a very evangelical, Christian evangelical point of view, and other officials who will be advising him on it. At the same time, he's the one who makes a decision at the end of the day. And he'll also be listening to people like Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi crown prince, and the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, and the Jordanian king Abdullah. So this is not someone that you want to anger or annoy. And I think that's kind of how everyone really in the region approaches him. Just go along with him as much as possible, flatter him as much as you can, and just have him on your side.
So that's what forced the Israelis to finally sign up to this deal, which, you know, as you say, has been doing the rounds for months. We've come close before. It's the Trump factor that really pushed them into it. How about Hamas? What was it that brought them to the table this time and brought them to an agreement?
With Hamas, it's always very, very difficult to kind of analyze what they're thinking. I think what we've seen is that they are not rational actors. And at the end of the day, a lot of these decisions are being made by their leadership in Gaza. And, you know, they have a very, very different set of calculations and beliefs than, you know, I think even the Hamas people outside who kind of rubbed elbows with the rest of the world and regularly met with all sorts of officials, whether Qatar or Turkish. And with Hamas, I think they went into this, the leadership in Gaza, really actually believing that they would destroy Israel in a matter of 1 or 2 years. I think what they thought was that they would attack Israel, drag in Hezbollah, drag in Iran, and have some great Armageddon type battle that would destroy Israel. What's happened over the past year and a half, I mean, if, you know, really take the sort of biblical analogy of Samson, where, you know, you had Sinwar and he wanted to pull the temple down on his enemies. And what he ended up doing was pulling it down on himself, his people, and his allies. Well, his enemies were more or less left unscathed. I mean, you know, what Hamas did, you know, they killed more than 1,000 people in their attack on October 7. But they never quite presented a strategic threat to Israel in the way you say that Hezbollah did. What Hezbollah did was that they emptied out a good chunk of Israel, of its inhabitants, for more than a year. So Hamas, a year and a half later, Gaza is destroyed. More than 45,000 Palestinians are dead. Sinwar is dead. The leadership is dead. The entire world and the region's telling them to put an end to the war and to compromise. They've lost their base in Qatar. The Qataris have asked their senior leaders to leave. So they haven't really gained anything from the war. And Hezbollah has been decimated. You know, Hassan Nasrallah has been killed, the leader of Hezbollah. The group lost much of its arsenal. And I think the final straw really was when Bashar al-Assad fell last month. And that means that Iran cannot replenish Hezbollah.
So a lot of their allies in the region are gone.
A lot of their allies, yeah, they're gone or they're weak, or very weak. And I think, you know, the Iranians very reasonably are thinking that, well, if Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, something that everyone thought would never happen and that they wouldn't go that far, the rules of the game have changed so dramatically. What would stop Israel from killing Ayatollah Khamenei. What's actually stopping them? There's not much that would stop them from doing it. And there's not much that Iran can do by way of retaliation. So that's the regional map that Hamas has had to read. And obviously, there's been a lot of pressure from Qatar, which was hosting their political leadership, from the Egyptians and from others. I think they've had no choice but to compromise.
And Sama, just talk us through that agreement. Talk us through the deal. What exactly does it spell out?
Well, so the first 42 days, Hamas will release 33 hostages. They'd already released about 100 hostages. I mean, they kidnapped more than 200 on October 7. They released 100 in a prisoner exchange. There are 100 remaining. Of those 100, at least 30 are believed to have been killed over the past year and a half. The numbers aren't certain. And of those remaining ones, they will release 33 women, men over 50, and people who have health condition or health issues. In return for roughly a ratio of 1 to 3, Israel will release Palestinian prisoners. And those include people serving life sentences for murder or attacks. At that time as well, over the next weeks, Israel will withdraw their forces to a buffer zone inside Gaza. And negotiations will start for a phase 2, in which Hamas will release the remaining hostages and Israel will withdraw entirely. And throughout that period, Israel will allow more aid into Gaza. You know, as we know, there's been a shortage of aid that's gone into Gaza. There's severe malnourishment, according to aid agencies. So more aid will be coming in. And then in round 3, phase 3, I think that's where we'll be seeing the start of a reconstruction program to start rebuilding Gaza and the release of the bodies of deceased hostages that Hamas are holding.
And that phase 3, does that basically end all hostilities? Is the war completely over?
Phase 2 would technically end the hostilities. But again, that's all dependent on whether they agree on a phase 2 in the first phase, because that's not guaranteed. Israel can say, well, Hamas hasn't kept up his side of the deal, so we're going to go back to war. There's no guarantees that the war will end, but there's a lot of optimism that the war will end. And certainly, I think with a Trump administration there, both sides, I think, clearly tired at this point of fighting. The hope is that they will come to an agreement to start a second phase and then a third phase for the reconstruction. I think at this point, we're seeing, even till now, are continuous attacks by Hamas against Israeli soldiers inside Gaza and fatalities, and also Israeli airstrikes that are killing Palestinians. But what hasn't happened is that Hamas has not been defeated as the power on the ground. They're still the most powerful faction on the ground, and they're still capable of governing Gaza. So that's going to complicate, obviously, phase 3 and moving forward, because we're talking about $80 billion that are needed to reconstruct Gaza. Years, if not decades, of work. And no country is going to want to commit to that if there is a chance that there will be another war. All the aid is going to be destroyed again, as has been the case in past attempts. You know, there's been several wars fought between Hamas and Israel. And after each war, you know, the donors, and they would hold an international conference, they would pledge billions in aid. The aid would go in, not all of it, but the aid would go in, the reconstruction would start, and it would be destroyed. That's something that they would like to see, a guarantee that it wouldn't happen again. And the only way that they can guarantee that really is if they get a final status agreement on a peace deal, pretty much.
Yeah.
A resolution to the conflict, some sort of Palestinian state or accommodation.
That's not part of this deal.
That's not part of this deal, no. This is a ceasefire deal. It's not a final status deal. A final status deal would entail a Palestinian state or some resolution of the conflict where both sides say it's over and the decades-long Israel-Palestine conflict is finished.
Sama, you set out the phases of this. You know, as you put it, it's a ceasefire deal. This is not a final peace deal. This is a ceasefire deal in 3 separate phases. People are saying that the deal already contains the possibility of lots going wrong. This could all fall apart. For people watching the situation, what should we be watching for? What are the critical moments when this might still all come abruptly to a halt?
I still think we don't know how many hostages are alive. And also, there doesn't seem to be yet be an agreement on the precise names of the Palestinian prisoners that Israel would release. That is one possible complication. The other would be the extent of the Israeli withdrawal. Will they stick to the timetable? Will they stick to the areas that they promised to withdraw? Or will they say, we need to undertake more military action and we'll need to the freedom of military action?
And Samer, we're already hearing that Hamas is demanding the right to decide which prisoners are released, and that, according to the Israeli government, has sort of triggered them to slow down on ratifying it. So they're postponing convening to vote on this deal, and they're saying they won't until mediators notify Israel that Hamas has accepted all of the agreement, as in they don't get to choose which prisoners necessarily. Even when that gets decided, as we're hoping it will in the next day or two, is there a danger that Israeli politics might still unravel this deal? Talk us through what's happening there.
Well, there's always danger, but I think the Israeli cabinet is going to vote for this deal because the opposition wants it, and factions in the cabinet are supportive of it, with the exception of the far right, Ben Gvir, Smotrich.
Netanyahu has a serious political problem in that hard right parties who are in his coalition are contemplating whether at some point in the first phase of the ceasefire agreement, the first 42 days, whether they should actually leave the government, try and bring it down, force a vote of confidence, because they believe that this is absolutely the worst thing that Israel should be doing right now.
It is in his interest now to end the war and to have this deal claiming victory. You know, he still has a lot of answers to face from the Israeli public about his conduct during the negotiations, why this couldn't have come sooner, and also the security lapse that led to the military and intelligence missing the planning for the October 7 attack. At the same time, you know, he has managed to accomplish quite a lot, and he does appear in some ways vindicated. You know, he's managed to all but destroy Hezbollah, severely weaken Iran, and also, you know, take some credit really for the ouster of Bashar al-Assad, because, you know, that came after a year of Israeli airstrikes on Iranian militias in Syria. So, you know, this is a good time for him to quit the war, and I don't think he's going to face a lot of resistance from that. I mean, he will obviously face a lot of recrimination and questions on why now, why not 6 months ago, when more soldiers were still alive and more hostages were still alive. So that's a question that he's going to face, I think, quite often in the coming weeks.
On the Palestinian side, Hamas seems to survive this deal. They haven't been destroyed as Netanyahu had promised. Who ends up running Gaza at the end of these 3 phases?
Well, so that's not clear. The Palestinian Authority would like to move in. The international community would like to see the Palestinian Authority moving in, particularly the Americans and the Saudis. On the other hand, anything they do will have to be done in concert with Hamas. And they have agreed on forming a technocratic government that would be staffed by technocrats from neither party, but agreed upon by both parties. But they'll basically need to undertake deep reforms before I think anyone signs off on it, particularly the Americans and the Emiratis. The Emiratis are expected to lead the funding effort and the reconstruction effort. And they have very, very deep differences with the Palestinian Authority. They host one of Mahmoud Abbas's main rivals, Mohammed Dahlan, who was formerly the chief of Gaza and who was expelled by Hamas. So the idea is that it would be a reformed Palestinian Authority that would eventually assume control in Gaza. Now, that's also something that's really opposed by Netanyahu. I think, Netanyahu, has indicated and has said publicly that he would not want to see a united Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, which would also put pressure on him when it comes to negotiating a Palestinian state. His view is that the Palestinian Authority have funded the families of militants who've conducted attacks against Israelis. But really, the idea of having to face a Palestinian Authority both in Gaza and in the West Bank would definitely put more pressure on him. And I think he likes to keep his maneuvering space and his options open rather than being forced into a corner when it comes to negotiations with the Palestinians.
So he'd rather have 2 separate Palestinian governments in Gaza and in the West Bank. Makes life much easier for him.
Yes.
Samer, this ceasefire deal has taken more than a year to happen. We've had months and months and months of a horrific war taking place. Give us a sense at the end of it of what the state of play is in Gaza at the moment. Just how bad are things?
More than 80% of Gaza has been entirely destroyed or damaged. At least 46,000 Palestinians have been killed. According to the Hamas-run health ministry, the UN and other international organizations and human rights groups, they've seen no reason to doubt these figures. And if anything, the numbers can be more, because there are people buried under the rubble, people who are dying of their wounds. So the human toll has been significant. Israel says that at least 18,000 of those people were Hamas or Islamic Jihad militants. And there's not much left of Gaza by way of schools, hospitals, infrastructure. Hundreds of thousands of people are living in tents. So that's going to take decades to sort out and to rebuild. In the meantime, the U.S. is saying is that Hamas has managed to recruit almost as many people as they've lost. That can be Sinwar's legacy. I mean, he's brought about a war that's destroyed Gaza. At the same time, he's radicalized another generation of Palestinians in Gaza.
As you said, actually rebuilding Gaza will take decades, but will aid be able to pour in now with a ceasefire deal? And how does that get administered? Will it actually make an immediate difference?
Humanitarian aid is expected to start flowing in again. The other aid is going to be tied to whether Hamas is there, whether they can use it for military purposes, as we've seen in previous conflicts. And also, will countries want to send aid for reconstruction while there's a threat of another war? I don't think that they will. So that mechanism, that arrangement still hasn't been worked out. But that's something I think that we'll be seeing in the coming months.
Even with this deal now going through, there are lots of question marks about whether it'll last. I mean, Ehud Olmert, the former Prime Minister of Israel, spoke to Times Radio and said,
"There's still Hamas around. They are negotiating, they are shooting, they are killing Israeli soldiers, unfortunately. So I think that Netanyahu wants to go on with this indefinitely, maybe, and as a result, we may, unfortunately, lose another group of hostages, or the 65 which are still held by Hamas. And I don't see an end to this presently."
As somebody who's watched the region for so long, do you think this deal will hold?
I think it'll hold, but the danger of it is it not transitioning to some final status talks, peace talks, and a resolution. Because if it doesn't, then if not in the coming weeks or months, but certainly in the coming years, we'll see another conflict. And that's something that the US and many countries in the region would like to avoid. Hence the talk about using the momentum from this ceasefire to go into negotiations for some form of two-state solution or political solution to the conflict.
And as you've already explained, this deal, the fact that it's happened now is so much a reflection of Donald Trump's shadow over the Middle East and how he's going to be influencing the region. Do we have a sense of what he wants as an end goal for the Middle East? I mean, does he even want a two-state solution?
Yeah, no, I think Trump would be very keen on a two-state solution. What type of Palestinian state? Obviously, that's up for debate, whether it would be a state in name only or whether it would have any measure of sovereignty. I think we saw a hint of it, or more than a hint, really, with the so-called Kushner plan, which was unveiled in his first term, which did allow for something that looks like a Palestinian state in parts of the West Bank and Gaza. We'll likely see him revive that plan, maybe with some adjustments to make it more workable and acceptable to the Palestinians and the Arab countries involved.
That was Samer Al-Atrush, Middle East correspondent at The Times. You can find more of our coverage of the ceasefire deal and the reaction to it across the Middle East at thetimes.com with a subscription. The producers today were Edward Drummond and Olivia Case. The executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Assetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.